Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Don't worry, you're not lost, you're just off the beaten rack. A few years back, I did a rough video about Scud the Disposable Assassin, but it's been bothering me a lot lately. Few other series from the 1990s managed to engender such a loyal and lasting fanbase or legacy as Scud. Enigmatic industry outsider and all-around mad genius, Rob Schrab designed Scud to be the antithesis of everything else on the stands at the time. Born from heartbreak and a desire to be seen and heard by the world, Schrab was unfortunately never as taken by the medium as many people perhaps would assume, given his choice to self-publish. In fact, this waning interest in the title, teamed with some disappointing missed opportunities and the near-complete implosion of Schrab's personal life and sanity, brought one of the most fan-beloved titles of the last 30 years to an abrupt end, leaving the titular lead character lingering in a cliffhanger rivaled perhaps only by Ben Edlund's Tick. Thankfully, unlike Edlund and The Tick, a decade after the series prematurely ended in 1998, the series did finally see a happy ending, and Rob Schrab returned to the series for a finality that literally no one, not even Schrab himself, ever saw coming. Join me tonight as we delve into the origins of one of the best kept secrets in comics, and we throw the creator, Firemen Press, Scud the Disposable Assassin, and so much more under the microscope for another insatiably deep dive into some sweet 90s nostalgia. So let us start our tale, a tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia, and a little video essay I like to call This Comic Will Self-Destruct, the story of Scud the Disposable Assassin. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really like what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about signing up for my Patreon page to help me continue creating videos. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to behind the scenes posts, exclusive content, and you can even get your name in the credits. You can also just tip the channel or make one-time donations using the Ko-Fi link in the description below, or sign up for memberships right here on YouTube. And if that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. It turned out that Teddy Tenenbaum, who Schrab had let write that issue of Tales from the Vending Machine a few months prior, had indeed shown the Big Ant movie script around, and to some pretty interesting people at that. He'd managed to get a copy to a few people, but Robert Zemeckis was the first person to bite. On the strength of the Big Ant movie spec script, Schrab and Harmon ended up inking a 2-picture deal with Zemeckis in months. And in case you're wondering, the other story they sold was Monster House. While it would take nearly 8 years for Monster House to finally see production, the money was better, he wasn't having to draw Scud anymore, and most importantly to Schrab, I think, he was doing what he had set out to do from day one, work in Hollywood. Rob Schrab got his foot in the door with the Zemeckis deal and would quickly climb the ladder to a respected place in television with credits that include Heat Vision and Jack, The Sarah Silverman Show, Community, and more recently, Rick and Morty. I don't want to get too mired down in Schrab's film career, as it's far more diverse and deep than I could ever hope to do justice as a simple aside here, and honestly, not too much of that really had anything to do with comics. For the most part, Schrab seemed genuinely disinterested and disheartened with the industry and his creation. However, in 2002, Schrab did notably produce an independent short film titled Robot Bastard. While it's obviously not Scud, the design is completely different and the robot has a pretty different personality, it wasn't hard to see the obvious nods and similarities if you knew what you were looking for though. Robot Bastard was Schrab's directorial debut, a true labor of love, and an absolute must-see for fans of Schrab or Scud. He built all of the props and much of the set himself in what would become something of a signature style, utilizing mostly recycled cardboard that he'd gotten from dumpsters around town, then shaping them around real-world objects and blending the two to create truly surrealistic props and sets. As a fun little aside here, since I'm just throwing everything in the kitchen sink I could find about Scud in here, while they'd managed to spell his name wrong, one of Schrab's earliest and fondest memories in film is his single credit on the original Joel Hodgson Mystery Science Theater 3000. Schrab helped write the very first version of the Santa Claus Conquers the Martian episode, which would go on to be one of the most popular and most often recycled films in MST3K history. Now, if you're not a diehard Misty, original host and show creator Joel Hodgson was born in Wisconsin and was still working the stand-up and improv scene around the time Schrab and Harmon were. I don't know when they first met, but I do know that Hodgson and Schrab have remained friends and kind of brothers in arms over the years. Following what had gone down in Los Angeles with his breakup and the death of Firemen Press and the Scud movie deal, and I think maybe some hard feelings among the few friends he had gone out there with regarding Scud's rights and the entire Firemen Press situation, Schrab was feeling increasingly isolated. And so it was that despite his recent successes, Schrab made the decision to return to Wisconsin and in fact Joel Hodgson's studio to create the suit props and much of the set used for Robot Bastard. I think the project was a real healing moment for Rob Schrab, and while it's not Scud, it's probably as close as we're ever going to get, and in a lot of ways I think this was enough for Schrab. On the merits of the film, Schrab even did a few music videos for people like Ween, as well as steadily becoming increasingly involved with the Hollywood machine, writing, producing, and eventually making the leap to his dream job of directing before long. During all of this, Schrab was completely immersed in his work. While never a major convention attendee anyways, he became basically entirely removed from the comics industry for all intents and purposes during this time. He was busy making a name for himself working on bigger and bigger projects as the years progressed, in television especially, but there was one thing that nagged at Rob Schrab: unfinished business that he never really stopped thinking about, or hearing the end of, apparently. While he hadn't been to a convention or even put out a comic in years, Rob Schrab says that he routinely got annoyed and angry letters from fans asking and demanding when he was going to finish Scud. Rather than just getting annoyed or refusing to work on the series on principle, though, I think these letters began to elicit a feeling of true guilt from Rob Schrab, who simply wasn't in any shape to work on the series and had ended it because of that. As time passed and he discovered more and more people who had read and loved the series, however, these feelings of guilt took deep root and I think bothered Rob Schrab much more than most of us would have suspected. He wanted to finish Scud. He really, really did. Schrab wasn't in the right headspace and he felt like he owed his fans more than that. Quote, "There was just so much anger and pain and fear going on in my life that if I were to have finished it, it would have been a very unsatisfying conclusion." This quote makes it abundantly clear. It wasn't that Rob Schrab didn't want to finish the series. It was just that he felt like he couldn't finish the series. And that bothered him more and more as time went on. Almost 5 years later, in a 2003 interview conducted by longtime friend and collaborator Jim Mahfood, the two shared the following back and forth, which I think shines a light on just how much this aided him for all those years. Quote, "Did you know that fans were really upset, and I think are still upset, that there was never a final issue? Do you care? I do care." I mean, you're kind of over it at this point, right? I mean, it's been 5 years or something. Would you ever consider f***ing with people and putting out a final issue and going, "Hey, sorry it's 5 years late, but here's the final Scud adventure"? Rob Schrab: "I'm always trying to work out a way to make Scud." However, while he always planned to get around to finishing the series, I don't know if it was in the way most fans expected or would have wanted. If you use the Wayback Machine, you can look at old versions of the Scud site, which is cool for a few reasons. One of the most interesting little tidbits that you can uncover, though, is an open letter from Rob Schrab dated February 13th of 2006 titled "What Happened?" In it, he outlines much of what we've talked about here, explaining why Scud disappeared from spinner racks overnight. He also included a surprising revelation that I think most fans never quite saw coming, saying, quote, "Scud and I have made up. we're friends again. Many of us who saw this when it was originally posted knew this was the moment we had been waiting for. Finally, after almost 9 years, Rob Schrab had decided to come back to the series and finish Scud for the fans like he'd always said he would. At the end of the frank and open piece, there was a small caveat that once again dashed fans' hopes, though. A small note that I thought would virtually guarantee we would never see the last issue of Scud. Quote, "Keep your fingers crossed. Hopefully you'll be watching Scud 21 instead of reading it." If this wasn't enough, in the Mahfood interview from 2003, 3 years prior, when asked about finishing Scud, Schrab said bluntly, quote, "The final issue of Scud will not be a comic book. It'll be a movie. The end of the series will be the end of the movie." When taken together, quotes like this seemingly put the final nail in the coffin for any hope that we longtime fans had harbored for over half a decade about Scud's return at this point. Even after he came to peace with Scud, or said he had, it still seemed like he would never return to the comic that had caused so many of us to fall in love with him and had in turn caused Schrab so much personal grief. Most of us tossed in the towel. I know I did. Schrab was obviously finished with comics, and there seemed to be no way of coaxing him back into even a single issue. Then, just when all hope seemed to be lost, on January 3rd of 2007, nearly a year later, Rob Schrab posted the almost unbelievable. The title of the post from that day on his site simply read in bright, bold print for all to see, "Scud the Disposable Assassin number 21. Below it was a close-up of Scud from issue 20, uttering the words which had once shattered his entire universe and left fans in a perpetual limbo for nearly a decade, now taking on an entirely new meaning and offering the first real glimmer of hope we'd had in more than 7 years. I'll do it." I think a lot of us were in kind of disbelief when we saw the post. There had to be some sort of caveat, a disclaimer, or something we were missing. There was no way Rob Schrab was coming back to comics, let alone Scud the Disposable Assassin, after so many years. It had been only a year earlier when Rob Schrab had gutted many of us by once again reaffirming that we would never read the last issue of Scud, only to then seemingly turn around and announce such an enigmatic return in the medium which he'd all but abandoned years before in utter disgust. To many of us, it felt like Scud's return, while more than welcome, quite literally came out of nowhere. Over the years, Rob Schrab had hinted at his interest in returning to comics, but always adding that this was not a desire to return to Scud, and that he had other stories that he'd like to tell instead. Quote, "I'd rather do a new comic book with a new character, just keep moving forward." While he'd said similar stuff in the past about a desire to return to comics, the problem had always simply been that Schrab didn't have the time. More than anything, as the years passed and more of this story came to light, it seemed that the main reason Rob Schrab had never finished Scud was honestly he'd just gotten too busy. It was a lot of work. It wasn't making him money. It wasn't fun anymore. And his career had quickly gone in a trajectory that made the time and effort required to make comics pretty much a waste of his time. In the end, working on a series would effectively cost rather than provide opportunities for the creator, and this precipitated his hasty retreat from the industry he'd once taken by storm. Given all of this, to say the announcement about his return caught many of us by surprise would be a most certain understatement. There were even some that thought it might be a gag or a joke by Rob Schrab, who is well known for his quirky sense of humor. And to be fair, if you follow him, this wasn't out of the realm of possibility. Thankfully, and despite my own initial skepticism, details began to slowly emerge about Scud's return. Most importantly, Rob Schrab agreed to answer questions that fans might have about Scud in the comments section of the post on his site. While he might have made the original post in jest, Rob Schrab would never have been so callous as to have messed with fans on such a one-on-one manner as talking about something that he knew he wasn't going to do. And more importantly, not talking about it. Rob Schrab said that while he was happy to answer questions about the series past, he wouldn't be discussing any details having to do with Scud issue 21. While some interpreted this as caginess, for those of us that had followed him long enough, this was the telltale sign it was really going to happen. He was going to do it, and he didn't want to ruin the surprise for those of us that had been patiently waiting for so long by this time. As details took shape and Rob Schrab began to spread the word to different media and news outlets that he was working on a conclusion of the series, it became increasingly evident to even the most skeptical of us that Rob Schrab was undertaking what many had come to believe was the impossible, something he himself had said he would never do. Rob Schrab was going to write and draw the final issue of the series he had intended to release 8 years before in 1998. While I was overjoyed by this news to say the least, I'm going to admit to being absolutely befuddled at the time as well. Why, after all these years, had Rob Schrab finally decided that he would return to Scud? When was it coming out? Who was putting it out? Was it going to be a one-shot? Would it be in color, black and white? My mind raced with questions, but it took some serious digging to uncover the answers, as is invariably always the case with Rob Schrab. The why in this equation is actually an amalgamation of factors, not just one precipitating event, which had all kind of converged, finally managing to make it apparent to Rob Schrab just how beloved his robotic assassin was. The first of these was that in 2006, the notorious Shocker Toys held a poll, or at least they said they held a poll. Lord knows about anything that Jeff Beckett Jr. says. But Scud was apparently voted one of the most requested figures by fans, at least according to Jeff Beckett. Now, Jeff Beckett Jr. then approached Rob Schrab about the license so he could include him in his upcoming Indie Spotlight series. I'm not going to get into the entire Shocker debacle here. If you want to learn about all of the nitty-gritty details, make sure to use the links in the description below to check out my Shocker Toys documentary I did not too long ago. While the toys produced are still considered some of the most accurate and highly coveted comic book action figures of all time, it would be years before the Scud figures were actually released in 2009. As I said though, this wasn't the only factor that led to Rob Schrab picking up the pen once again, and as it turned out, Jeff Beckett Jr. wasn't even the only one interested in resurrecting Scud around this time. As 90s nostalgia was really starting to come into fashion and receive a good deal more coverage and discussion as more and more children of the late 70s and early 80s reached early adulthood, it also turned out that Kevin Smith happened to be a huge fan of Scud as well. Incredibly influential, with a generation that was already increasingly recalling Scud with rose-colored glasses and fond memories of their teen years. Kevin Smith apparently made some pretty flattering posts about Rob Schrab and the series on his message boards at the time, highly recommending that people check out Scud if they hadn't done so already. This helped to not only turn a lot of new people onto the series, but it also kind of galvanized old fans of the series in their opinion that it had been a rather genius series, and it even helped some people who had read the series those many years ago, but had either forgotten about it after its unceremonious death, or hadn't been able to track down complete runs when it was originally released. If all of that weren't enough, in a final twist of fate, that same year, Doug TenNapel had been approached by Image Comics about re-releasing Gear in the collected trade paperback that we've talked about before. While there was virtually no ancillary or extra material for the original release, there were pinups by Mike Mignola and Rob Schrab, and because they wanted to include the pinups, Image had to secure permission from Mignola and Schrab to run the pieces anyway. Now, as I've said, Doug TenNapel is one of the very few individuals in the comic book industry that has consistently spoken about, championed, and brought Rob Schrab and Scud the Disposable Assassin to the forefront of conversation, seemingly whenever possible. Whatever else you might think or say about the man, Doug TenNapel is a serious fan of Rob Schrab's, and the two seem to enjoy a pretty close friendship. Because of this, when TenNapel was writing the foreword to the original Image trade paperback release of Gear, he talked briefly about meeting Rob Schrab and the motley Firemen Press crew in what I can honestly say I believe is the only retrospective piece of writing or information about the company ever published. Given his love for Rob Schrab and Scud in particular, I have no doubt that while Gear was being colored and the ancillary material was being prepared, that Doug TenNapel was constantly dropping hints and talking about Rob Schrab and Scud to Image publisher Eric Stevens, who happened to be personally overseeing the project. Whether through direct or perhaps even subliminal suggestion, before long, Stevens reached out to Schrab in hopes of getting him to release something for Image Comics. See, I told you that little detour into Gear and Cat Scratch would pay off. When Eric Stevens first reached out to Rob Schrab, he asked if he was still interested in releasing one of the new stories that he talked about in interviews over the years. After Rob Schrab said he was definitely interested in putting something out and working with them, Stevens and Image then approached Rob Schrab with another idea which would basically all but seal the fate of Scud's resurrection, and truth be told, is probably the real reason that they hit him up in the first place. Eric Stevens asked if Rob Schrab would be interested in finally collecting all of the Scud material in one place, much of which had either been long since out of print in trade paperback format or was never collected at all, into an oversized Cerebus-like phone book in the style of Marvel's Omnibus series, actually, which had started only a few months prior to this with Fantastic Four Volume Number 1. While it might sound strange given how much he'd come to hate working on the series, Rob Schrab immediately jumped at the idea of getting the series back out. He's admitted over the years, while he didn't miss working on the book, he certainly missed and certainly still loves Scud, who will very much always hold a special place in his heart. There was one huge problem for Rob Schrab when it came to the Scud collection, though. There was no ending. Even if you included every scrap of Scud material that was out there, it wouldn't really be a very fulfilling read if there was no ending. At least not in Rob Schrab's eyes. The fact this series had no ending had bothered Schrab for years anyways at this point, and Schrab was becoming acutely aware of just how many people wanted him to finish the series and how badly they wanted it. And I think this had only served to deepen his guilt over having not finished it to begin with, and his desire to finally do just that after all these years. Following Kevin Smith's discussion of the series, the Shocker Toys poll, and Eric Stevens' interest in publishing new material from Schrab as well as the Scud collection, I think Rob Schrab kind of decided it was now or never. He could either release the series as was, lacking an ending, something that would probably eat at him to no end, and he might not ever get a chance to fix like this again, or he could seize the opportunity that Image was interested in new material along with the Scud reprint anyways to finish the series up after all these years. It didn't take long for him to come to a decision apparently, and with his mind finally made up, Rob Schrab called up Eric Stevens and pitched him an idea. Rob Schrab asked how they would feel about publishing an extra 20 or 30 pages in the Scud trade paperback as a kind of final issue where he could tie up all the loose ends and provide fans with the ending they had been clamoring so many years for. Stevens excitedly told him that it would be a great way to market and sell a collection, that he would eagerly look forward to whatever Rob Schrab came up with and sent their way for inclusion with the trade. With this in mind, Rob Schrab sat down and started working on wrapping up Scud in a single 20 or 30 page issue that would have been simply included with the collection rather than ever published on its own as a standalone floppy or anything. Rather unexpectedly, however, when Rob Schrab sat down to finish this series, it started kind of pouring out of him. There was a lot more to wrap up than he had anticipated. There was a whole universe that he had to conclude, and it just kept ballooning up on him. He finished 20 pages, then 30, then 35. When he blew past 40 pages, Rob Schrab knew it wasn't going to stop, and it was at this point he decided he should probably call Eric Stevens to let him know what was up. I don't know if Rob Schrab expected him to be upset or what, but adding 50 plus pages to a collection is no small feat. It requires completely reworking bindings sometimes and several other things, as well as recollating pages. It can be a real headache. That being said, when Rob Schrab explained the situation to Stevens, he was definitely surprised, but not in the way I think Schrab might have feared. Stevens asked Schrab, quote, "How long is it going to be?" Rob Schrab responded, quote, "I said like over 100 pages." And he goes, "Wow, I thought you said it was going to be like 30 or 40. I said, I know, I'm really sorry." Rather than being upset though, Stevens, however, made an interesting suggestion. Quote, "If the book is that big, let's make it a 4-part miniseries and we'll put that out before the big collection of the whole book." Rob Schrab agreed moving forward that would be the optimal way to go and continued work on not only the new material, but also set to assembling the necessary material for the reprints of the original issues as well. And apparently, this was not an easy thing to do. A few years prior to 2006, when Image and Schrab had started work on the Scud collection, there had been a disastrous fire at the Canadian plant which had printed and stored the screens used for Scud the Disposable Assassin. This fire unfortunately claimed basically all of the original screens used in the original series. This meant that all of the original art then had to be tracked down instead. The art then had to be painstakingly rescanned and subsequently cleaned up if there was any damage to the original pages, some of which had been floating around the private collector's market for the better part of 10 years by the time Rob Schrab and Image were undertaking this task. Through a great deal of tenacity, no small amount of luck, and due largely to the fact that Rob Schrab knew most of the people who had purchased his original art, they thankfully managed to successfully track down all of the original art and set to scanning it all in. This, however, came with its own dangers. The urge to tamper with, clean, or even entirely redraw certain things was something that Schrab was painfully conscious of while working on the Scud collection. Thankfully, he has actually said that one of Mike Chilean, who helped with page layouts and a few other things on the collection, but one of Mike Chilean's big jobs was to, quote, slap his knuckles with a ruler when he started thinking about or talking about, quote, fixing or changing anything. While obviously rather tongue-in-cheek, this little fact means a lot to some of us. While I'm perhaps one of the biggest Max fans on the planet, I am very upfront about the fact I cannot stand the colors on the Maximized edition. They're muddy and boring, and I'm glad they make Sam happy and he got to do them, but there's absolutely no comparison between them and the original Ollie Optic colors, and no one will ever convince me otherwise. And what was worse was Sam talking about how he wasn't going to, quote, George Lucas or director's cut his work, when he did just that and so much worse. He didn't just add a few scenes, he completely recolored the film essentially and made it into an absolute bloody mess. Okay, although Scud obviously wasn't printed in color, so there were fewer temptations when it came to this kind of thing, it was nice to see Rob Schrab was so intent on simply reproducing the original series as faithfully as possible and not meddling or changing or fixing things. I wish we saw this level of involvement and dedication from more people in the industry, and I wish it was encouraged and allowed when it comes to collections, which is how a growing number of the comics community consume their comics. While much of this reticence to rework material and even the urge to perhaps have it colored were driven by the limited amount of time that Rob Schrab was able to devote to the project, given the originally 1930-page issues had been done in black and white, even simply coloring them would have been a dizzying prospect. It seems that this was never Schrab's intent, however, and I think this is well illustrated by the fact that Rob Schrab didn't just stop at reproducing the art from the original series as closely to the original form as he could, though. Oh no. If he was coming back to Scud, he was going to do it right. As we've discussed, Rob Schrab had drawn the first few issues of Scud on his kitchen table during the halcyon days of Scud and Firemen Press. He said that he messed with computer backgrounds on 5 issues and he hated the results during the original. So basically every facet of Scud's art was done by hand. Because of this, after a while, he'd invested in a drawing table and gotten an assistant who did some of the screen tone and zip tone work for the series. But during the intervening years between the end of Scud in 1998 and Schrab deciding to finally finish the series in 2006, he'd had to get rid of that table for space reasons. As he set to work on the new series with no little amount of irony, he was again at the kitchen table drawing pages of Scud. After almost 9 years, the lengths he employed to ensure that there was no, quote, jolting differences between the original art and the new art was absolutely mind-blowing and nothing short of commendable. One of the more distinctive features of Scud was its use of screen tones and zip-a-tone. Because the book was printed in black and white, this gave the pages an almost tactile feeling, like you could tell what Scud's increasingly ravaged metal exterior might feel like. There was a very physical sense to the book in a lot of ways. This was an important holdover from Rob Schrab's early interest in independent comics, which we discussed earlier. While computers had progressed, and it would probably have been infinitely easier to just throw the art on a computer and use a program to digitally simulate the screens and tones, Rob Schrab chose to draw the pages exactly as he had during the original run of the series, cutting the screens and applying them himself this time. Given the success he enjoyed during the period since he'd left the series, there was more than a small amount of irony. He was back at the kitchen table drawing, but what resulted truly was nothing short of astounding. All the time and effort he put into the artwork blending really paid off. And if you were to simply put the Image Scud collection titled The Whole Shebang in front of someone, I would defy them to tell me where the break was, or that there was even a gap in publication. The writing is certainly a little bit different, as Schrab was nowhere near as nihilistic, depressed, or angry as he was when he was originally finishing the series. But Scud shifted and changed from issue to issue anyways, and this new material really didn't feel weird or out of place for the title. All things considered, this lengthy break in publication probably did actually work out to Scud's advantage in the long run, believe it or not. As I said, the original ending for the series was going to be Scud stabbing Jeff in the heart, Jeff dying, and then the entire world exploding. It was super dark and not entirely tonally in holding with a lot of the rest of the series, honestly. This ending had been born of Schrab's frustrations and heartbreak, however, things which had all mentally subsided for him by the time he chose to return to the series. In completely overhauling the original ending, Rob Schrab has explained why he felt like Scud earned a happy ending, and a lot of that has always been because Rob Schrab is Scud the Disposable Assassin. Schrab had kind of found redemption through his struggles on Scud and came out a much stronger and happier man for it. While he just ended a relationship and was super depressed when the series was finishing up, by 2006, he was living a happy, comfortable life, married and enjoying a career doing what he had always wanted to do. And that's where he was coming from with those final 4 issues of Scud, not the nihilistic, self-deprecating place that the final 3 or 4 issues of the original run would have come from. All of this taken as a whole, the new ending for Scud didn't feel out of place at all to me in the slightest. Honestly, I think the whole world blowing up, following through on something like that would have felt weird and out of place. Instead, after so many years with new wisdom, a happy and healthy career, and love life giving Schrab an entirely new vantage point on life, he delivered a nearly perfect wrap-up to not only this series, but the universe and the characters of Scud the Disposable Assassin as well. The tone of the series had started out as so jovial, fun, and kind of braggadocious in a lot of ways that the increasing despondency and nihilism only makes sense when it finally breaks, like a great wave rolling back to reveal the same kind of positive, frenetic energy that began the series lurking just beneath the surface once again. While he managed to basically seamlessly tie up the universe, everything looks amazing, and the books came out without a hitch. Unfortunately, working conditions were once again less than optimal for Rob Schrab, who toiled thanklessly away on his beloved creation one last time. Okay, well, maybe not so thanklessly this time, but you get the idea. While most people in comics didn't know it, Rob Schrab was working on the miniseries in his spare time, and I do use that term loosely here. Conversely, I doubt that few people in his Hollywood circle, aside from some Comic-Con regulars like maybe Brian Posehn, were aware that Rob Schrab was finishing work on his magnum opus, or indeed that perhaps Rob Schrab had ever even put out a comic to begin with. As it turned out, that spare time that Rob Schrab was talking about didn't really amount to much either. At the time, he was doing the mini for Image. Rob Schrab was also writing and directing the Sarah Silverman show on Comedy Central, which was in the middle of filming its first and second season at that point. Because Schrab was not only one of the head writers, but a director on the series, it wasn't like he could take time off of the show to work on a comic. He just kind of had to suck it up, work countless sleepless nights, and push himself to the point of physical and mental exhaustion once again. As I said, Rob Schrab was at a much better place in his life, both physically and mentally by this point, and a big part of that was due to his relationship with longtime life partner and now wife, Katie Freund. In Freund, Rob Schrab seems to have not only found a kind of kindred spirit that truly understands and appreciates Rob Schrab for who and what he is, but is infinitely accommodating and supportive of his career, and this includes Scud. Funnily enough, circling back to when we first discussed Schrab's early desire for acceptance and attention because of his comic book work, it seems like this never really stopped. According to his wife, Rob Schrab brought a copy of Scud the Disposable Assassin #1 for her as a gift on their first date. While it might seem weird to some people, Freund got it. And in a way, Scud has always been an important and integral part of their relationship because it's a big part of who Rob Schrab is. So when Rob Schrab decided that he was finally in the right place to go back and finish this series, and when the pages just kept pouring out of him and he couldn't seem to stop, no matter how much he wanted to, she was there to help and support him in a way he had never experienced when working on the series in the past. According to her foreword for the whole shebang, Rob Schrab would wake up around 6 a.m., draw until around 9 or 10 a.m., go and direct the Sarah Silverman show for a full day, then come home and work on Scud pages until he would basically collapse. But this time, he wasn't alone. Freund sat with Schrab, keeping him company even all throughout his sacrifice weekends as he toiled away on pages doing virtually nothing else for months. And if that sounds a wee bit dramatic, you need to understand something. Rob Schrab had to turn down some pretty high-profile work that would have paid well and could have seriously padded his resume. The most notable probably being that he had to turn down directing a Tenacious D music video in order to get Scud done and out on time. He could have delayed the series, gone, shot the video, and then come back, but Rob Schrab felt like he owed it to fans. The series had been solicited, and he was feeling inspired, and he was willing to make some pretty serious sacrifices to make Scud happen. In some ways, it was just like the old days. He was killing himself, putting everything he had into Scud, and he was still falling behind. There was little acclaim, and the paycheck certainly wouldn't be anything like he was getting for his work on television and other projects. In other regards, however, things could not have been more different. Schrab was no longer toiling away in seclusion and completely sealed off from the world while working on the series. Freund was there every step of the way to cheer him on and remind him why he'd chosen to come back to the series to begin with. This time, Rob Schrab was armed with an optimism and a drive that he hadn't been before, and that's shown in every single panel and page of the astounding work that he was turning in for the project. In interviews, Rob Schrab has said that ironically, this should have been the last time he was thinking about doing a comic book. He was legitimately busier than he had ever been in his life. Scud was again eating up all of his free time, and in the process, costing him some serious opportunities. To him, It was worth it. This time around, though, Scud had gotten him into Hollywood. The loyal fans had paid his bills, or at least tried to, and if he had to give Scud up for movies at one point to build his career, he seemed willing to return the favor for however long it took him to get the series finished and out to fans who had been waiting so patiently for nearly a decade. His career was going better than it ever had, and it didn't seem like it was going to be slowing down anytime soon. While this might sound like a daunting time to take on a monthly series, even if only a 4-issue mini, Rob Schrab has said it was because of this success, because of the push that it gave him, that he was finally imbued with the necessary confidence and drive needed to be happy with what he was doing enough to allow him to finally return to the character after so many years. While they didn't make finishing this series easier, I don't think, along with Freund and a few other factors, it had to have helped. Scud had been a kind of monkey on his back, taking up part of his brain and kind of eating at his guts for years. It was time to get him out of his mind onto paper and to finally be finished with the character and the series and not have it dangling over his head anymore. In regards to the entire situation, Rob Schrab said in one interview, quote, "It's weird because Monster House was nominated for the Academy Award and the Golden Globe, and Sarah's show had the first and second season this year. It's going really great, and you would think that during those years where my career wasn't doing so great in Hollywood, I would have jumped back into comic books. But for some reason, I got a rush of success and kind of felt invincible and said, I'm going to tackle that thing that's been in the back of my head for so long. I'm just going to do it." And thankfully for all of us fans, that's exactly what he did. He might not have enjoyed all of it. It might have been a pain and a headache, but he did it. And for that, I will always personally be grateful. While he's often fairly critical and somewhat dismissive when it comes to his work, Rob Schrab seemed really happy to finally be working on Scud again in a lot of ways, despite the conditions and long hours. Quote, "Right now, I'm digging everything that I'm doing. I'm really, really happy about it. I will say with all humility that it is some of the best work that I've ever done, I think. Just getting out those pages and putting the book back together, I really, really fell in love with it." And he's not lying. The pages were almost electric with the energy again. You could feel the revitalized energy in every line of the new series. It felt like for the first time, Rob Schrab and his creation were okay with each other. And as a fan, that felt really cool. While I think a big part of this was that Rob Schrab was finally at a time and place in his life where he could finish Scud and kind of finally close the chapter on that part of his life in a really positive way and share that experience with all of us. He was in a good place with his career and he had a loving wife and a happy home life. But another big part of this, at least from what I can tell, is that I think Rob Schrab was finally able to let the idea of a Scud TV show or movie go. If it happened, it happened. But it wasn't something he was going to obsessively pursue when it came to the character anymore. After more than 12 years of disappointment, dangerous highs, and some heartbreaking lows, I think this was something that Rob Schrab really needed to get off his chest. He needed to be at a place where he was okay with Scud the Disposable Assassin, and a big part of that was being okay with the fact that Scud the Disposable Assassin is a comic book. It is not an Oliver Stone movie. It is not an MTV animated series. And if the comic never gets adapted, that's okay. Oddly enough, it seems that a big part of that was, I think, accomplished ironically through Schrab's decision to return to the character and complete the series after all those years. Just following the completion of the Image run in 2007, Rob Schrab said in a 2008 interview, quote, "After 10 years of trying to get him off the ground as a TV show or even a video game, it's a tough sell. But if Scud never gets past the comic book, I would be completely satisfied because I finally concluded it. And I concluded it in my own terms. I'm really happy with how it's concluded." Rob Schrab finished by saying, quote, "I kind of want to get out this final chapter, me just putting it behind me in a decent place. If Scud never existed past the comic book, I'd probably be fine with that. I think it's a great character. It's a hard nut to crack in terms of taking it to a movie or a TV show, and I'm kind of moving forward. Things are going really great with me. I'd rather do a new comic book with a new character and just keep moving forward." This was no small thing. There have been talks of a Scud film, or at least an animated short, since before there had been a Scud to talk about. I think it was one of the first books that I ever read where basically the sole intent and purpose of the book was to have been to get it licensed from day one. Or maybe it was that Rob Schrab had no pretensions about what he was doing and never apologized for liking what he liked and wanting to do what he wanted to do, and he shouldn't have. Plenty of people are doing the same thing today, and no one bats an eye, but 30 years ago, it was a big deal to some people. Over the years, there have been more close calls than I can even begin to recount. There's promotional books from the Oliver Stone Eatlon deal. They got so far as auditioning Ron Perlman, hot off of Hellboy, as the voice of Spider-God for the proposed MTV animated series. Scud's been close, and more than once. And who knows? We might still see a Scud movie or a TV show. I think there's an increasing audience for a show like this as the days pass, and I think there's more people willing to produce content like this than ever before. But thankfully, it doesn't seem like Rob Schrab is hung up on or obsessed with this any longer. When you see something like the recent Jeff Smith strip about his feelings on the numerous proposed Bone animated adaptations over the years, I think that kind of sums it up better than words ever really could. You have to tire of that kind of cat and mouse, hurry up and wait kind of mindset mentality before too long. Those close calls and all that anticipation leading nowhere. It has to be rough. Letting go of all that is an important part of Rob Schrab finally getting to a place where he's okay with Scud. I don't think he'll ever do another Scud comic, but that's okay. I don't need anything else. I'm just thankful that after all the trials and tribulations, all the doors that Scud opened and closed for Rob Schrab, that he was finally able to get to a place in life and in his heart where he could complete the series and be happy doing it. I never saw it coming, and I don't think he really did either. And I think Rob Schrab summed up his feelings on the series pretty well in a quote from another Jim Mahfood interview, this time from 2020, saying, quote, "Was it worth it? Worth all the effort? Yes. Did I enjoy the ride? No. Was I living in the moment? No." Because the thing about the comic book was always like, I'm doing a comic book to get an animated series. You know, I'm doing it to get from the drawing into the camera. I wanted to make movies. I wanted to do that. So it was always like, how long is it going to take before I can do that leap? I wish I would have enjoyed it a lot more when it was there, but it was just so much work. Making it was a bi-monthly, and it still seemed like every single hour of the day I was just drawing, and it never was enough. For my own part, for some reason, I keep thinking back to the immortal words of Hunter S. Thompson, and to paraphrase, strange memories on this nervous night in Los Angeles. 20 years later, 30? It seems like a lifetime, or at least a main era, the kind of peak that never comes again. Scud the Disposable Assassin in the middle 90s was a very special time and place to be a part of. Maybe it meant something. Maybe not in the long run, but no explanation, no mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive in that corner of time and the world, whatever it meant. History is hard to know because of all the hired bullshit, but even without being sure of history, it seems entirely reasonable to think that every now and then the energy of a whole generation comes to a head in a long, fine flash for reasons that nobody really understands at the time and which never explain in retrospect what actually happened. So now, less than 30 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Los Angeles and look west, and with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark. That place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, updates, exclusive content like uncut interviews, interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel but Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. You can finally sign up for membership right here on YouTube. Just hit the little join button and make sure to select the tier and perks that fit you best. If that's not enough, you can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below. And you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this video was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting Service, as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I seriously want to thank every single one of you that supports the channel and helps make these videos possible. I really hope the quality and content is getting better, and I can't wait to see where the next year takes us with your continued support. Thank you again for helping this crazy dream of mine become a reality and for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. And as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.